Another day, another story. Thousands of rail workers in states across the country protested poor pay and working conditions in a massive and violent uprising. In the summer of 1877, the United States experienced its first multi-state railroad strike. Welcome to Tabo Eminent Channel. Starting in West Virginia, the strike quickly spread to other parts of the country, and even turned into a general strike in some cities. The protest involved some 100,000 workers, making it the largest in the country's history at the time, and brought major railroad lines to a halt. Railroad companies and elected officials ended the strike by sending militias to attack workers, resulting in an estimated 1,000 arrests and 100 deaths. Although workers in some cities won small gains by striking or threatening to join the strike, the 1877 uprising didn't lead to any widespread victories for railroad workers. It did, however, demonstrate the key role that railroad workers played in the United States, and the power they held if they stopped working at the same time. The 1877 strike was remarkable in that it involved no national-level organization. Rather, its spread was a spontaneous reaction to pay cuts and poor working conditions during an economic depression. A wave of spontaneous strikes. The 1877 strike took place amid the Long Depression, an economic downturn beginning in 1873 during which wages dropped and poverty and homelessness increased. It was in this desperate climate that on July 16, 1877, workers of the Baltimore and Ohio B&O Railroad station in Martinsburg, West Virginia went on strike to protest the railroad's pay cuts. There's good evidence to suggest that the railroad owners, at least informally, colluded with one another to cut workers' pay, says John P. Lloyd, a history professor at Cal Poly Pomona who has written about the 1877 strike in the Encyclopedia of Strikes in American History. After the B&O Railroad cut wages, the Pennsylvania Railroad and others soon followed. The Martinsburg strike started as a local labor action, but within days, it had spread to Pittsburgh, where the Pennsylvania Railroad was already highly unpopular. Many Pittsburgh residents felt that the company had an outsized influence in the city, and supported the railroad workers who went on strike. When the government sent in Philadelphia's militia to break the strike, Pittsburgh's militia had refused. Workers set fire to the roundhouse at the railroad depot while the militia was inside. From Pittsburgh, the 1877 railroad strike, which was really a wave of strikes, spread westward to cities like Chicago and St. Louis. In these and some other cities, the railroad strike turned into a general strike as non-railroad workers joined in to protest poor pay and working conditions. The strike wave impacted just about every major railroad in the United States, and elected officials and railroad companies responded by deploying local and state troops and privately hired militias. In addition, President Rutherford B deployed federal troops to attack workers. He actually used the provision of the Constitution regarding insurrections, says Troy Rondino, a history professor at Southern Connecticut State University and author of The Great Industrial War, Framing Class Conflict in the Media, 1865 to 1950. So he was basically saying this is an insurrection against the country. Though the strike lasted for different lengths of time in different places, it was largely over by the beginning of August. Legacy of the 1877 strike. When the 1877 strike ended, most railroad companies did not meet the demands workers had made. In Louisville, where white railroad workers decided not to strike, these workers ended up avoiding pay cuts by siding with the Louisville and Nashville L&N Railroad against a general strike by black workers. The L&N Railroad workers were very threatened by this idea that the black workers were organizing, and so a lot of white workers in Louisville actually supported the company and even formed their own militia to protect railroad property, says Shannon M. Smith, a history professor at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University who has written about the 1877 strike in Louisville. So rather than siding with other workers, they sided with the company. One of the major impacts of the strike was the increased presence in U.S. cities of local militias that later became the National Guard. After 1877, these militias began to construct imposing armories in working-class areas. This was because the strike had demonstrated the power of national labor organizing at a time when there was no national railroad union, only job-specific railroad brotherhoods. The size and scale of the 1877 strike rattled company executives and elected officials. Nearly 2 decades later, the American Railway Union, considered the first major railroad union, played a pivotal role in the 1894 Pullman strike and marked a turning point in national labor organizing. Still, racism remained a factor in labor activism. Although some white and black workers organized together during the 1877 general strikes, the exclusionary racism among railroad brotherhoods continued with the American Railway Union and in many other workers' unions into the 20th century. The strike you're referring to is likely the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, one of the largest and most significant labor strikes in United States history. It was a nationwide strike that involved thousands of railroad workers and had a profound impact on the labor movement in the country. The immediate cause of the strike was a series of wage cuts by several major railroads in response to the economic depression that began in 1873. Workers, already facing difficult working conditions and low wages, were further angered by these cuts. The strike began in Martinsburg, West Virginia, on July 16, 1877, when railroad workers walked off the job in protest of a second wage cut by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. The strike quickly spread across the country, involving workers from various industries, not just railroads. It reached major cities such as Pittsburgh, Chicago, and St. Louis. The strikers engaged in widespread acts of civil unrest, including blocking railroads, damaging equipment, and in some cases, engaging in violent clashes with law enforcement and militia. In response to the strike, state and federal authorities intervened with force to suppress the unrest. President Rutherford B. ultimately called in federal troops to quell the disturbances, marking one of the earliest instances of federal intervention in a labor dispute. The use of military force led to significant casualties among the striking workers and their supporters. The strike ultimately failed to achieve its immediate goals of higher wages and better working conditions. However, it had a lasting impact on the labor movement in the United States. It highlighted the power of collective action and raised awareness about the challenges faced by industrial workers. In the years that followed, the labor movement grew stronger, leading to the formation of labor unions and the eventual improvement of working conditions for many American workers. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 was a massive labor strike that erupted in response to wage cuts imposed by major railroads during the economic depression of 1873. Beginning in Martinsburg, West Virginia, on July 16, 1877, the strike quickly spread across the United States, involving workers from various industries and major cities. The strikers engaged in acts of civil unrest, including blocking railroads and clashing with law enforcement. In response, President Rutherford B. deployed federal troops to suppress the unrest, marking one of the earliest instances of federal intervention in a labor dispute. The intervention led to casualties among the striking workers. While the strike did not achieve immediate success in securing higher wages and better working conditions, it had a lasting impact on the labor movement. The events of 1877 highlighted the power of collective action and contributed to the growth of the labor movement, eventually leading to the formation of labor unions and improved working conditions for American workers. In the bustling city of Pittsburgh, the echoes of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 reverberated long after the last echoes of marching boots and protest chants had faded. The strike, which had paralyzed the nation's railroads, had left a deep impact on the working class, inspiring a new wave of solidarity and activism. As the smoke cleared from the fiery clashes between strikers and authorities, a group of determined workers in Pittsburgh decided to channel the momentum of the failed strike into a different form of resistance. They formed the Steel City Workers Alliance, a coalition of laborers from various industries united in their pursuit of fair wages and improved working conditions. Led by charismatic figures who had been at the forefront of the 1877 strike, the alliance sought to create lasting change through negotiations rather than direct confrontation. Drawing inspiration from the events that unfolded in Martinsburg, they organized peaceful protests, lobbied for worker rights, and engaged in dialogue with sympathetic employers. The Alliance's efforts gained momentum as workers from steel mills, coal mines, and factories joined their cause. The city, once divided by the violence of the strike, now witnessed a growing unity among its labor force. This collective strength compelled some employers to re-evaluate their labor practices, leading to incremental improvements in wages and workplace safety. Over time, the Steel City Workers' Alliance became a model for peaceful, collective bargaining, influencing labor movements in other industrial hubs across the country. Their story became a symbol of resilience and the power of organized labor to bring about change, even in the face of adversity. The legacy of the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 lived on through the ongoing efforts of workers who, inspired by the events of that tumultuous period, continued to fight for the rights and dignity of the working class. In the small railroad town of Springfield, Illinois, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 had left a lasting impact that went beyond the immediate labor disputes. As the community grappled with the aftermath of the strike, a group of resilient workers decided to take a different approach to address their grievances. Inspired by the notion of peaceful resistance, several former strikers and sympathetic community members formed the Springfield Workers' Cooperative. Unlike traditional unions, this cooperative aimed not only to negotiate better wages and working conditions but also to create a self-sustaining community that could withstand economic uncertainties. The cooperative began by pooling resources to establish a community-owned market, where local produce and goods were traded among members. This not only provided a more stable source of income for the workers but also fostered a sense of solidarity among the townspeople. The cooperative expanded its initiatives, creating a cooperative daycare to support working parents and organizing skill-sharing workshops to enhance the community's collective expertise. As word spread about the Springfield Workers' Cooperative, neighboring towns took notice. Inspired by the success of this grassroots movement, workers in other areas started forming their own cooperatives, adapting the model to their unique needs and challenges. Over time, the cooperative movement became a symbol of resilience and community empowerment, challenging the traditional power dynamics between workers and employers. The spirit of cooperation and mutual support that emerged from the ashes of the 1877 strike created a ripple effect, influencing other labor movements across the country. The story of Springfield and its workers' cooperative highlighted the transformative potential of solidarity and grassroots organizing, showcasing that even in the face of adversity, communities could forge a path toward economic justice and self-determination. Thanks for watching. Request you to subscribe the channel.